And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless.
Okay, guys, looks like we are live. We've got a fun one here tonight. We have two very seasoned debaters. Both of these gentlemen are no stranger to debates. That means we are in store for one to remember. Today we are debating the historicity of Jesus. I want to thank both Godless Engineer and Praise I Am That I Am for giving us their time for this very important debate. I'm excited. So a few short announcements, though, before we get started. As you can see in the corner, we've got Dr. Ron Garrett and Dr. Ken Hovind going at it on July 9th. So you are not going to want to miss out on that one. We've also got Ken Hovind taking on PhD evolutionary biologist Dr. Dan Cardinal at the end of the month. That's another one to look forward to as well. And we are almost done confirming Dr. Cardinal and Dr. Kevin Anderson. So that one is one I'm excited for. And you would know Dr. Anderson from the Is Genesis History film. So a lot to look forward to this month. That one should probably be sometime next week. So enough from me, though. Let's give the debaters both an opportunity to introduce themselves, plug in their channels, break the ice kind of thing. We can start with Godless Engineer. Thanks for being here tonight.
Oh, thank you. I'm always excited to talk about this particular subject area because I'm very passionate about it. I've done a lot of research into it, and I even have an app on the app stores that kind of covers a lot of information concerning this particular area, and that's called Crestus, if anybody wants to check it out. It's available on both Google Play and the Apple iStore. But I'm, like I said, I'm very passionate about this particular topic area, so I can't wait to, get into the discussion.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for giving us your time again. Over to you, Praise.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate John taking his time out tonight and to engage in this discussion. I'm passionate too about Jesus, and hopefully I can bring a case, maybe a convincing case to John, maybe to convert to Christianity someday. I know it's not that simple, but maybe some points can be made. So that's my hope. Maybe to bring some point, even if that doesn't happen, maybe some people in the chat will learn something. And my channel is focused on apologetics and just providing arguments for God and such like that. So I can't wait. I'm ready to get going here.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it there, Praise. Yeah, it's going to be a pretty much an informal discussion tonight. We're going to give Praise, let's say between 10 and 12 minutes to do his opening, whatever time you need there, Praise. Then if Godless Engineer would like to, we can give a quick rebuttal, and then we'll just go right into discussion mode. I expect there to be a big audience tonight, so we'll try and get to as many questions as we can for the Q&A. So whoever has questions, just please make sure you're tagging me, Standing for Truth. I'll save them, and we will make sure we have a good Q&A. So enough for me, Praise. I'm going to hand it over to you. I imagine you need to screen share, so take your time. Yeah, and we'll go from there. Thanks, guys. Sweet.
This should, I'm not sure how long it'll take, but it'll be under 10, I'm guessing. That's my guess. So, is the biblical Jesus historical? So firstly, it's imperative to establish which profile for the historical figure known as Jesus is correct. Evidently, there's a radical distinction between an ordinary man who supposedly was a mythologized figure early first century, and the biblical Jesus who was a messianic figure that performed miracles. I would also like to point out a legendary Jesus who didn't really perform miracles is inconsistent with the profile that historians and ancient texts have divulged, as shown next. The historical profile of Jesus supports the biblical account, and this is from Bart Ehrman from the New Testament Historical Introduction to the Christian Writings. And here's what he says. Whatever.
Hey, praise! I'm so sorry to interrupt
yeah.
you, but the front facing on the live stream is kind of broken up, so people can't really see.
I'm sorry. That should do better right there.
Yes, you just gotta share.
I'm
with
just gonna
everyone.
start all over, man, because that should be better. You guys see that better?
Yes, it looks good now. Yeah, honest mistake. No worries.
That was my mistake. That was a error on my part. But here we go. I'm gonna start all over. Is the biblical Jesus historical? And say, firstly, it's imperative to establish what profile for the historical figure known as Jesus is correct. Evidently, there's a radical distinction between an ordinary man who supposedly was a mythologized figure early first century and the biblical Jesus who was a messianic figure that performed miracles. I'd like to point out a legendary Jesus who didn't really perform miracles is inconsistent with the profile that historians and ancient texts have divulged, shown next. And the citation is actually from Bart Ehrman, New Testament Historical Introduction, the early Christian writings. Here's what he says. Whatever you think about the philosophical, so he's already putting it in the philosophical realm to deny the biblical Jesus, possibility of miracles. It's clear that Jesus was widely reputed to have done them. And Jesus probably did have some pretty amazing encounters with people believed to be demon-possessed. His ability to cast out demons was seen as a characteristic of his ministry. On numerous layers of our traditions, Jesus is said to have healed those with various ailments. And here's another citation from Greg Blomberg. Jesus was most certainly an exorcist. And the citation's there. And here's another one from Marcus Borg, a scholar and theologian. It is virtually indisputable that Jesus was a healer and exorcist. And this one is from Dominic Crossan, and he is actually not a believer in the biblical Jesus, which is interesting. You cannot ignore the healings and exorcisms. And here's another one from Rudolph Bultmann. There is no doubt Jesus really, I want to highlight that word really, healed the sick and expelled demons. And here's another one from British scholar A.M. Hunter. For these miracles, the historical evidence is excellent. And here's one from Paula Fredrickson. Most historical Jesus scholars today, regardless of their personal theological orientation, do accept Jesus drew crowds who believe that he performed cures and exorcisms. So this is where we go into validating the biblical Jesus historically. And this is a quote from Michael Cleghorn from the Dallas Seminary. Even secular New Testament historians believe that Jesus was a successful healer. Even more surprising, these historians no longer attribute Jesus' healings to pure legendary embellishment. The legendary hypothesis has been largely discarded for good reason. Legends take time to develop. The Gospels were written within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses to Jesus. It is unlikely that within Israel, many glaring misrepresentations of Jesus' life recorded in that within the Gospels could move, originated, and spread within 1 or 2 generations after his death, since many eyewitnesses would have still been alive to contest these gross inaccuracies. It would have also been peculiar that many testimony. I'm sorry here. I got lost my position here. So it would then also be peculiar that many Christians willingly accepted the martyrdom in AD 64 and earlier off the testimony of a few men in their accounts of Jesus in their Gospels greatly differed from a more sober-minded and believable oral tradition, further bolstering the contention that a historical Jesus was a successful healer is the fact that the Messiah was not expected to work miracles. Therefore, the gospel writers would not have been felt compelled to turn to Jesus into a miracle worker if he were not one already. Furthermore, if Jesus never worked miracles, early hostile Jewish literature would likely state this fact. Instead, Jesus is called a sorcerer in these accounts, thereby degradingly affirming the supernatural. Most secular historians do not believe that Jesus could heal real illnesses or perform any actual miracles. That having been said, it is interesting to note that the more amazing the miracle, the more evidence is seemingly available to support the fact. And like I said, this is from Michael Cleghorn, Dallas Seminary. Now I want to do addressing objections from mythologizers. Jesus and evolving mythology, question mark? And this is what Jesus mythicists like to purport. Multiple generations, so this is a quote from Greg Blomberg, and he addresses this. In his quote, multiple generations would have to appear to be required for the true oral tradition regarding Jesus' life to be replaced by an exaggerated, fictitious version within the general geographical region in which Jesus lived and taught. For example, many historians believe that Alexander the Great's biography stayed fairly accurate for about 500 years. Legendary details did not begin to develop until the following 500 years. So here's another one, hostile accounts of miracles. And this is from Morton Smith, Jesus Magician in 63. So not only do hostile accounts fail to deny Jesus' supernatural abilities, they also seem to support the ability of his followers to heal in his name. In the Talmud, there is a story about a rabbi who was bitten by a venomous snake and calls on a Christian named Jacob, to heal him. Unfortunately, before Jacob can get there, the rabbi dies. And here's the reliability of miracles. There is just a surprising amount of evidence that the historical Jesus performed miracles. John's gospel was written within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses to Jesus. In the resurrection of Lazarus, John includes many details that would make it easy to check John's story. The fact that John's account could easily be confirmed or denied based off these details suggests that it was credible. What about psychiatry? Do you think so that would be a possible excuse for these miracles? Well, this is what David Instone Brewer has to say about that. Quote, psychiatry cannot explain the insight that many of the demonized have into Jesus' identity. The man in the synagogue shouted out that Jesus was the Holy One of God, Mark 1:24, Luke 4:34. The madman of Gadara called the Son of the Most High God, and this is Mark 5:7, Matthew 8:29, Luke 8:28. Many other demonized people are also recorded shouting that he was the Son of God and having to be silenced, Mark 1:34, etc. In this insight into Jesus' character cannot be explained in psychiatric terms. And I'm going to address, there is no contemporary problem. Contemporary requirements are unreasonable and fallacious. So in modern times, people leave out a lot of evidence they exist within a period of time. Birth certificates, financial documents, school records, etc. And prominent modern people have lives documented by media almost daily. However, to expect the same credentials for ancient characters is an anachronistic error known as presentism or a presentism fallacy. So this is the definition of the presentism fallacy from historians.org. Quote, in literary and historical analysis, presentism is the anachronistic introduction of present-day ideas and perspectives into depictions or interpretations of the past. Some modern historians seek to avoid presentism in their life work because they consider it a form of cultural bias, and it creates a distorted understanding of their subject matter. And this is Huntlin, and against, and there's your citation, historians.org. And this is a quote by Peter S. Williams, peer-reviewed Jesus Exorcist. Gosh. Consider the time between the original writing and the earliest surviving manuscript, between Aristotle writing his philosophy of our earliest copy, lie 1,450 years. Between Herodias and copies lie 1,300 years. Between Pliny the Younger and our copies lie 750 years. Between Homer and our earliest copy, again, this is the closest comparison, lies 500 years. Between the New Testament and the earliest surviving manuscript lies 100 years at most. And here's one from William F. Albright. Every book in the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the first century AD, very probably sometime between AD 50 and 75. So the criteria of historical authenticity, so this is one of the ways we can determine that, is the criterion of multiple attestation. Example, casting out devils through Beelzebub is recorded in Matthew 12:27, Mark 3:22, and Luke 11:15. What about the criterion of embarrassment? But the forgiveness of Jesus' own sins when he was baptized by John has set the theologians on subsequent centuries of conundrum for how could Jesus have been baptized for the forgiveness of his own sins when, according to Christology, was developed after his death, he was divine and therefore sinless? The embarrassment caused by this dilemma is enough to refute modern denials that the Baptists ever baptized Jesus at all. For once again, the evangelists would have been only to be glad to admit the perplexing event, but they could not. And this is Michael Grant, an atheist historian. What about the criterion of dissimilarity? Jacques Dupont presents a convincing case that double dissimilarity. For instance, the core of the temptation story must be from Jesus and not inspired by some situation of the early church. After Jesus' death, the political messianicism held no appeal to the church. Yet, during his earthly life, Jesus was incessantly pursued by the crowds to reveal himself as the Davidic heir, and the king thereby assumed the role of messianic king, liberate the people and the land from the yoke of Rome and set the political kingdom. What about the criterion of Semitism? Evidence of Aramaic Semitic background points to historical authenticity. Example, Mark 15:34, and this is from Bart Ehrman, that Jesus exists, and also the historical argument for the Jesus of Nazareth, chapter 3. Eli, lama sabachthani. The criterion of Palestinian environmental phenomena. The tradition of originating in Palestine, if it includes Palestinian social, agriculture, domestic, or religious customs. And here it is, Mark 4:3-8. And here's the last one I like to use, is the criterion of coherence. The criterion of coherence states that whatever statements of Jesus that are supported generally by the other criteria were more likely to be authentic. This assumes that one has been able to isolate some authentic material from the other criteria and have established a database from dealing with other sayings. This is unlike the Jewish method of judging a prophet. The Torah was the database by the prophetic books were evaluated. If they contradict the Torah, they would not be authentic. And here's your example, Matthew 5:38-48, and Luke 27-36, where Jesus says, love your enemies. And yet, he was documented scolding the Pharisees in Matthew 23 and Luke 11. Demonstrates the criterion of dissimilarity. And this is by Meyer. So, why are there skeptics despite the overwhelming evidence? So, of course, I don't want to go through all these because it would be too long, but I'll just do a few. Quote, of course, most liberal scholars today do not believe that Jesus could actually heal any real illnesses. However, this belief is not deprived from any historical evidence. Rather, this conclusion is the result of prior preconceptions against the supernatural because they do not believe in the supernatural. Secular historians deny that Jesus cured any real organic illness or performed any nature or miracles such as walking on water. This is Wilkins In Moreland, Jesus under fire. I'll just do one or two more. Quote, if it doesn't seem to bother deniers, they themselves have no specialization in the academic field. They disparage because any of the field of study, there will always be at least some small contingent who go against the consensus. The existence of these outliers is justification enough for the deniers to say this business is far from certain. Just look at these four people who disagree. That's how I feel when people in the skeptic community argue that Jesus never existed. This is Carter, and I'll do one more. In a quote, Jesus existed, and those vocal persons who deny it do so because they have not considered the evidence with the dispassionate eye of the historian, but because they have some other agenda that this denial serves. And this is Bart Ehrman. And the conclusion is, the unavoidable conclusion one must come to terms with, is this person, Jesus Christ, is not only historically certain, but Jesus's miraculous nature is juxtaposed with the same historical certainty. For someone to separate one from the other is not only to bastardize the historical data points, but the scholarship that scholars and historians have conclusively brought forth. But even worse is to foolishly deny the evidence altogether, which my opponent shamelessly does out of philosophical bias, as several authorities have pointed out. And with that, I end my time, and I give it over to John.
Okay, well, thanks so much there, Praise. Thanks for the visuals. Depending on Godless Engineer's preference, we can give you an uninterrupted rebuttal round if you'd like, then discussion, or right into discussion. It's totally up to you.
We can go right into discussion, but I'd like to, I guess, lead that charge.
Right. Yeah, and you can take as much time as you want in the lead. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so first off, what we're discussing here tonight is the biblical Jesus, right? So it's Jesus as he's represented in the Bible. And I think that is a very important point, because there's a clear separation between the historical Jesus that most of the scholars that you would consider to be on your side of things, they would take up the minimal historicity sort of claim, not the pure biblical claim of a historical Jesus. So, I feel like arguing from authority here really doesn't work for you, just because of that fact. For instance, the entire way through your presentation, all you did was throw out like quotes from people. You didn't give me any kind of actual evidence. You just quoted authors and are suggesting that they are correct just because they're scholars or historians, which I don't know if they are historians. A lot of New Testament scholars are referenced to as historians, but they're not actually trained in history. Like Mike Licona, he's not a historian. He's a New Testament scholar. Same thing with Gary Habermas. He's not a historian. He's a New Testament scholar. So a lot of these people that you're referencing as historians, I'm betting are really just either theological scholars or are New Testament scholars. So bringing them up as historians is not entirely accurate. But we can start off with the arguments from authority. Why use arguments from authority rather than like actual evidence?
So yeah, I'd like to address that. Number one, I did bring up several evidences, especially with the the criterions for authenticity. I gave evidence for that, but I also gave other shreds of evidence too. Some other particular, like with John's Gospel, that was an example I used. But I think one problem is, this is what IP talked to you about before in his last debate, that there's nothing fallacious to appealing to the scholars, especially when I myself am not a scholar, or you. So I would have to appeal to the scholars in some fashion or form to do that. That is not fallacious to do that. It is fallacious.
Oh, no. Hold on. Let me stop you right there, because it is fallacious. Using an argument from authority is fallacious when that is your argument to prove that something is true. I mean, like, just take, for instance, one particular claim is that the Gospels were written during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. They weren't. The majority consensus is that they weren't, that they were actually written later. So you're internally going against your own standard here by going with the quote unquote consensus of people. So using arguments from authority are fallacious if that is your evidence that something is a fact. And you definitely did that in your presentation.
No, I wasn't saying that their quotes itself was proof that Jesus was miraculous. No, I'm appealing to the data that they formulated and what they put together and through all
Okay, give me that data. Give, like, just on one topic, just the Gospels, when they were written. Give me the data, not quotes from scholars or quote unquote consensus. Just give me the data on why you think that the Gospels were written during the time of the eyewitnesses. From, I believe at one point you quoted somebody as saying between 40 CE and like 60 CE.
Right. So now this is through the whole scholarship community, from non-believers to conservative dating. It dates from Mark 40s to mid 50s, and then liberals would be 60 to 70s. So Matthew would be, for conservatives, would be 40s to 60s, and then liberals would be 80 to 90s. Luke would be 50s to 60s, and liberals would be 80 to 90s, and John would be mid 60s and 90s, and liberals 90s. So that's demonstratable, though. I mean, I can give you several evidences if you want me to, and go through all that.
Well, considering that's what I asked for, that would be great.
Okay. Well, number one, so the Gospels were written because, for number one, the destruction of the temple. We know that the synoptic Gospels mention the destruction of the temple, and we know that was before 70 A.D. So do you agree with that?
What, the destruction of the Jewish temple was before 70 AD?
Yes.
No, I mean, it was right around 70 AD. We know that Mark, that's one of the particular things, facets of Mark, that points to it being written after 70 AD.
Right, but if they mention the destruction of the temple, doesn't it follow that these Gospels, these eyewitnesses, would be in that time frame?
No.
How so?
Well, because these people could be writing in the 70s about things they thought they knew that existed prior to that point. I mean, there are authors out there that write historical fiction all the time.
Are you appealing to anonymous authors then? Because I think that seems where you're going with
They
this.
are anonymous. All the Gospels are anonymous. None of them name their authors.
And I would object to that. And there's several arguments I could give to refute that. And number one, the first and perhaps the biggest problem for the theory of anonymous Gospels is there is no anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have ever been found. And this is even a citation from Bad Picture.
Sans the titles that were placed on them later on in time most notably by Papias. All of them, none of them actually name their authors. It's not like these Gospels came out and it was the Gospel according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Like, they weren't titled that way. They were just the Gospel of Jesus.
I think that's a straw man argument. It's not
a straw man argument. How is it a straw man argument?
I mean, I'll explain that. So all four Gospels are anonymous in the formal sense, that the author's name does not appear in the text of the work itself, only in the title. But this does not mean that they were intentionally anonymous. Many ancient works were anonymous in the same formal sense, and the name may not even appear in the surviving title of the work. For example, this is true of Lucian's life of the Demonox or Demonocatos Bios, which is a bios, ancient biography. So there's an example right there that refutes that claim.
Okay, the Gospels were not titled. I don't know if you missed that part of what I just said. they did not have titles on them, so they were completely anonymous. Now, just to put this into context here, that is the consensus of historical scholarship, even theistic historical scholars. In New Testament,
so you're appealing to the consensus now.
Hold on, I'm done talking. So that's the consensus. So right now, me going against the consensus for whether or not Jesus existed is the exact same position as you going against the consensus that they are named. So I'm wondering how do you deal with that particular problem right there? I mean, you obviously go against the consensus on a number of different things.
Lucian. So, like I said, yeah, in the formal sense that they're anonymous. But that doesn't mean that it appears in the text of the work itself. It's only in the title.
And I just said that they did not have titles.
Right.
They didn't have titles. So they weren't named.
Doesn't mean they were intentionally anonymous. Many ancient works were anonymous in the same formal sense. And the name may not even appear in the surviving title of the work. An example is Lucian's Life of Demonics. You can check that out. So there's a good example where we know Lucian is the author there.
Okay. I don't understand why we're talking about Lucian when we should be talking about the Gospels, because a lot of your arguments hinge on the idea that the Gospels were written during the time of the eyewitnesses, when they just simply weren't. They were written much later, when eyewitnesses would have been dying off if they could have even survived to the 70s AD. And we know that it was the Gospel of Mark that was written first after 70 AD. Then Matthew was written in the 80s. And then Luke was written at least after 93, so that puts the Gospel of John in the 2nd century.
I mean, but there's still
that is the timeline,
right? So there's paradoxes with your anonymous theory too. I'm gonna give another problem with this, is the utter implausibility that a book circulating around the Roman Empire without a title for almost 100 years could be somehow at the point be attributed to the exact same author by scribes through the whole world, and yet leave no trace of disagreement in any manuscript. So I'd like to see you address that paradox.
Wait, can you repeat that paradox? I'm not sure I understood it.
So the second major problem with the theory of the anonymous Gospels is the utter implausibility that a book circulating around the Roman Empire without a title for almost 100 years could somehow at some point be attributed to exactly the same author by scribes throughout the world, and yet leave no trace of disagreement in any manuscripts.
Okay, well, I don't understand why you think multiple people independently titled these works the way that they're titled.
So are you going now to the synoptic problem? Is this like you're just going around like rabbit holes? Is that where you're going with this or not?
Well, I'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't like try to guess where I'm going and maybe just answer the question that I'm asking.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to answer the question from your point of view, because I'm trying to gauge where you're coming from so I could give a valid answer.
Okay, well, I'm just simply asking why. What evidence do you have that multiple independent people titled the Gospels the way that they're titled?
So here's one example would be the work of Theophilus. So this is with Luke. I'm going to give an example of an independent case of an author. So the clearest case of Luke is because of the dedication of the work of Theophilus, Luke 1:3. Probably a patron. It's inconceivable that a work with the name dedicatee should have been anonymous. The author's name may have been featured in the original title, but in any case could have been known to the dedicatee and other first readers because the authors would have presented the book to the dedicatee. So there's an example right there of independent authorship.
No. I mean, that does not answer the question that I asked.
How so?
Well, like, okay, so for instance, we get what we know of as like the gospels that are titled Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Well, we know that they're titled from Papias, and he's the first one to suggest that these gospels were named in such a fashion, and that the people that supposedly wrote them. So I'm wondering, Papias said it, and I believe Papias was in like what was it? Papias was in the early 2nd century. So can you give me a piece of evidence, a source that is prior to or congruent or at the same time of Papias, that was not influenced by Papias, that also titled these documents this way?
So are you looking for a non-biblical source, or can I use internal evidence to demonstrate that's the case?
The Gospels never name their authors. The thing that you brought up with Luke does not say that Luke wrote it. So I don't
internal evidence.
I don't
It is
think
the
that
case,
you can
though.
cite anything within the Gospels that would give me the authorship or like who authored it, who claimed to have authored it. Like that's just simply not there. So no, you're going to have to use somebody outside of the Gospels.
But I just gave you an example of Lucian that he didn't do it either, but yet historians and author, they attribute that to Lucian.
So sorry, Grace. I am not talking about Lucian. I'm not talking.
I'm giving you
about
an example, though.
any other work. I am talking about the Gospels.
consistent.
Can you just
That's all
give me
I'm saying.
one piece of evidence of somebody other than Papias in the early 2nd century that
You're
was
not accepting
talking
my
about
evidence,
these
though.
documents,
I'm
giving
giving
them
you internal
those
evidence.
names?
I gave you
What?
Luke 1:3 as evidence of internal evidence. Luke is the original author, but also
that's not evidence.
I
that
can
Luke
give
wrote
you
it.
another one,
Luke
and John, if you want me
authored
to, I can do that. But how is that not evidence, though? Based on what?
because, and I'll say this for like the 4th or 5th time, none of the Gospels name their authors within their own texts.
So what? That's what the
fact.
ancient works.
That's
That's how
fact.
they organized it.
Huh?
That's how they organized their works. That's the way they did things back 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, whatever it was.
Okay, I'm not sure what time scale you're working on, but we can move on from this point because we're just going to go around in a circle, and I don't want to spend the entire time arguing about who authored the Gospels.
Yeah, so all I'm showing is there's internal evidence for the original authorship of the Gospels, and I've given you evidence, but you're not accepting it for whatever reason.
Yeah, maybe since we did have a good discussion on that topic and those points, maybe if we just go back to the historicity of Jesus and kind of start there. Go ahead, guys.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm just going through Praise's opening thing, just pretty much line by line. I made about
no problem. That's good.
Individual notes. So the next one is that the Messiah is not expected to work miracles. I'm wondering, are you familiar with Matthew 11:2-5?
I would have to look it up. Maybe you could read that out.
Do you mind if I read it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so Matthew 11:2-5 says, "Now when John heard in the prison the works of the Christ, he sent by his disciples and said unto him, Art thou he that cometh, or look we for another? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Go and tell John the things which ye hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good tidings preached to them." Now, do you have an inclination of where Matthew gets that understanding that Jesus would do those miracles?
Sure, Isaiah. Yeah.
Do you know the specific verse?
It's like 40 or 41, somewhere in there. I don't know the specific.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. It's actually Isaiah 35:5.
Okay.
He says, the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Now, this was in reference to the coming Messiah of Judaism, right? So the fact is that the early Jewish Christians had an understanding that their Messiah was going to do these miraculous things. So I'm kind of curious, what evidence do you have to suggest that the Messiah was not expected to work miracles when that's clearly laid out in their scriptures. And that's exactly what the Jewish Christians would have been expecting in the first century BCE as well as the first century CE.
So firstly, I'd like to push back on that, and I would say those are not necessarily literal. Jesus used spiritual blindness many times to be blindness in a spiritual sense. And some of these other things I think could be more in like an evangelical sense. So I wouldn't say that it's not necessarily those passages you mentioned are in a physical sense, like to be actual miracles and such like that. But to give you a verse that would demonstrate that he wasn't coming to do miracles. So I'm going to go through, let's see here. Maybe like he would be, like Jeremiah 23, that he would, for Judah, like he would fulfill the line of Judah, which would be the king line, but also the prophetical line, the Levitical line, which means that he came to preach, and that's all really Jesus came to do, is bring the salvational message to the Jews.
I mean, I wouldn't say that particular passage means that he only came to do those things, but I would also like to draw your attention to a site called accordingtothescriptures.org. They have a list there of 353 prophecies about Jesus that's in the Old Testament and directly connects to the New Testament. In that list, you will find number 208 in that list is the very verse that I'm talking about, where it says that he is to have a ministry of miracles. So it is definitely a thing that early Jewish Christians were considering these things to be prophecies of Jesus, and that he was supposed to work miracles. In fact, I bet you didn't know this, but did you know that pretty much all of the miracles that Jesus does in the Gospels are actually rewritten from the Elijah and Elisha miracles, as well as the other unnamed prophet miracles that appear in the Old Testament?
Right. In fact, that's a good point. I can use that to show that that it wasn't magic, and that this actually he was a example of how that Jesus couldn't be construed with any type of magic or anything, because he did what you just mentioned there would demonstrate that he was using the power of God to do these what we call miracles, miraculous things. So that's another thing that you mentioned. That's actually a point that it would actually be in favor of my viewpoint, not your viewpoint. But
No. So I don't understand how that's in favor of your viewpoint when there's so let me lay this out. In the Old Testament, there are a number of verses that Christians and Jewish Christians in the first century would consider to be prophecies about Jesus's life and ministry, things he was supposed to do as the Messiah. And then people that understood this, like for instance, Paul, I believe it's in Galatians 1. He talks about advancing in his Judaism far past the other his elders and his other people, right? His peers. He advanced far into his knowledge of Judaism, and because Paul was like that, there were other Jews that were also like that were interpreting these things this way. So they definitely had the concept that Jesus was to come and do miracles as part of his ministry.
Okay, can I respond to that?
Even Paul talks about how he got his information about Jesus from the scriptures and from visions. Those were his sources for things that Jesus did. And so since Mark uses Paul and then all the other gospels use Mark, that's why you have miracles in the ministry of Jesus, because in the first century you had Jewish Christians out there that had this understanding that Jesus was supposed to do miracles, and that these miracles were supposed to be the exact same miracles as the miracles in the Old Testament, but Jesus was supposed to do them a lot better, bigger, and stronger, because he's supposed to be the ultimate Messiah, the ultimate prophet.
Right. So I'd like to. You know who Giza Vermis is?
Who?
Giza Vermis. She. They are. I'm not sure if it's he or she, but they are a scholar, and this is. I have a citation from them. It addresses everything you said. I'd like to read that citation since you did ramble on for about 3 minutes straight there. Maybe I can give this. Is that okay if I get my citation within that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. But I mean, to be fair, you rambled for 10 minutes at the very beginning of this debate.
But I mean, that was my opening. You had your opening too. You could have had your own opening, but I mean, that's how debates are formatted. So I'm not sure like how that would be an advantage. I'm gonna let that one go. You can have that. But so scholar Vermes opposes so the Crossman makes the exact same argument you're doing by drawing a sharp parting line between Jesus and magicians, putting Jesus's miracle working in a charismatic pattern set by prophets Elijah and Elisha in the Second Temple Judaism. Holy men such as Honi, the circle drawer, and Hanina ben Dosa were true heirs of this old charismatic line. Although Jesus was said to have cast out demons, no rite was mentioned in connection with these achievements. In accordance with the miracle activities of the holy men, Jesus' supernatural abilities are not derived from magical techniques and secret powers, but from immediate contact with God. In consequence, Vermes is convinced that Jesus was not the paramount example of early Hasidism. John P. Meyer disputes Jesus should be labeled as magician. He claims a sliding scale of miracle and magic. The ideal type of this miracle worker is situated at the one end of the spectrum, ideal type of the magician at its other end. Meyer sees an objective basis for designating Jesus' supposed wonders as miracles instead of magic, even though in few cases magical traits are present in the miracle stories. So my point here in this citation is to show he was taken after these type of people in Judaism, Hanina ben Dosa and Honi the circle drawer. He was going after their type of character, or that type of figure, which shows that there's nothing about magic or anything which you're claiming to overdo it. So no, I think that would I think that would disprove what you were saying there, and a refutation of that.
Okay. That would be really nice. That quote that you gave there, which isn't evidence at all. You didn't mention any kind of evidence in there. But also, did I say the word magic? I mean, I am kind of curious as to how you define magic and differentiate it from the power of God. But I did not say magic whatsoever. And this is, again, you assuming that I'm talking about something when I'm just simply not. What I laid out to you was evidence, a clear line of evidence of it existing, and the understanding, like the claim that Jesus was supposed to do miracles existing, then the understanding that Jesus was supposed to do miracles existing, and then Jesus doing miracles appeared because there was already this pre-existing understanding that he was supposed to do. I'm not saying that they were magic. I never said they were magic. All I laid out was the fact that the Gospels ripped off the scriptures in order to give Jesus miracles in their Gospels.
And I was my citation actually debunked that, because they were going after the template, or you can say a figure, of Honi the circle drawer and Hanina ben Dosa. He was going after that type of characteristic or figurehead, if you want to call it that Jesus was going in that type of that way with that type of Judaism. So he was fulfilling what they were representing. You get what I'm trying to say?
Jesus the person was fulfilling what they were saying,
or what they represented. Yes, which.
No, that doesn't follow at all. Like, literally. So, like, for instance, if I write a book now that describes an understanding of Mormonism, right? And I describe like some future hero of Mormonism as having certain characteristics or doing certain things. And then somebody else comes along later who has the understanding that this supposed hero was supposed to do these things. And then he writes about some random hero that does these things. Does that mean that that hero actually existed? Or is he just making stuff up based on an understanding that was already prevalent in the community?
No, these are types. That's what I'm trying to bring up to. So I'm trying to get this point across to you, that these are types, and Jesus fulfilled these types of charismatic and healers. So like I was saying, like if you can look these, if you don't know who these people are, you can look up Honi the Circle Jar, Hanina Bendosa. So these were charismatic characters in the Jewish literature. And this is what Jesus, there are types that Jesus fulfilled. And this is just like I've seen in other streams that you've done, you tried to make the argument, well, there's a Jesus ben Joseph and a Jesus ben David. And somehow Jesus was trying, or he was mythologized and he was made to fulfill those characters. No. Jesus was fulfilling those types. He was fulfilling the type of a Messiah that would fit the mold of David, and it would fit the mold of Joseph, but also he would fit the mold of like these characters I just mentioned. So I think that's pretty clear.
You were mentioning the two different messiahs is actually in the Talmud, and you can literally go look up the Talmud and you can see where it has that theology in it. Technically, what I said was that the difference between those messiahs and Jesus is that Jesus is just the two messiahs merged into one. This represents a place in history where the ideas diverged. Jesus was combined in the Christian line, and then for the Jewish line, they stayed separate. So that's technically what I did, what I said. But also, just so that we can move on from this point after this, so maybe I can get just a simple yes or a no out of you. Are you saying that it's far more likely that Jesus was fulfilling these things, these molds, as a historical person? You feel that is far more likely than just people having the understanding that he was supposed to do those things, and then they made things up in order to make him fulfill that role. Like you think that there's a greater probability that a historical Jesus fulfilled those things rather than somebody just making it up because they had the understanding.
Yeah, the way you frame that, it's hard. It'd be hard for me to specifically address that, but I'll try to do the best I can because I'm not. That was kind of confusing way you said that, but I would say.
I mean, I gave you two choices.
Right. So I would say no. Jesus was not coming to be with bravado. And this is in Isaiah 53:3. He's coming not with bravado. It's right there in the scriptures. So no, I would say no. He's not trying to show, hey, look, I'm the Messiah. Look at all the miracles. I can throw whatever they had, boulders, and throw them in the air. Look at me. I mean, supernatural and all this stuff. No, that's not the profile Jesus was coming to fulfill. He was coming to fulfill a humble figure. Zechariah 9:9 perfectly actually says that verbatim almost. He's coming lowly on an ass with salvation. He's not coming as a supernatural figure. So I think that point right there refutes what your argument.
No, it doesn't. Like, I really don't think that even comes close to you giving me a yes or no on my question. But also, do you recall what Jesus told one of the 10 lepers that he healed? Do you remember that miracle?
Yes, I do. And I'm not sure if this was the exact same one you're talking about, but go ahead.
So I was just gonna enlighten people that may not know. Basically, there was a miracle. Jesus was in the quote midst between, I believe it was Galilee and Samaria, maybe. But anyways, he was walking along, and these 10 guys, these 10 lepers, come up to him from a distance and ask Jesus to heal them. And Jesus just says, "Go, show yourself to a priest." And they start to walk away. They're healed. Only one of them, a Samaritan, turns around to give thanks to Jesus. And of course, Jesus is like, "Wait, there's only one of you that turned back? What is this?" And so he's like, "Go, tell no one, but show yourself to a priest." He literally, all throughout Mark, especially Mark, Matthew, and Luke, was specifically telling people, "Hey, don't tell people about me. I'm not miraculous." I mean, it wasn't until John, which was written in the 2nd century, that Jesus sort of, kicks the door into everything. And he's like, I'm God, y'all bow to me, and on all this other stuff. I'm censoring this for the crowd that I'm talking to, obviously. But my point is that the John was very much out there as being miraculous, supernatural, and everything like that. While the synoptic gospels, they have Jesus playing it low key, not being all spectacular, but also fulfilling what people understood that he was supposed to fulfill.
So yeah, I'd like to push back on that. Firstly, in John 3, it says, "This is the Lamb that take away the sins of the world." Did it say this is the supernatural master king of the universe come to show
when did I say those words?
Well, that's what you're trying to claim. Like, this is what
I said.
This is what the caricature that you were making there when you're trying. Oh, look at John. No, I think you're making it a false dilemma there. No, I would say that's not the character. That's not what's being portrayed.
So you're saying that John is the Gospel of John does not have a Jesus that's very open about being the Son of God and being miraculous and that.
Even Muslims complain about this. Even Muslims say, where does in the Bible it says where Jesus says, "I'm God, worship me"? Have you ever heard of that?
I didn't say that he said, "I'm God, worship me." I said that in John, he's very much out there about being the Son of God.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, but what does that have to do with what we're talking about?
Huh?
So what does that have to do with what we're talking about and with your argument?
Well,
so
you said you made the
point,
claim that
please?
Jesus was not what you use the word bravado. Like he Jesus wasn't coming in to be like, "Hey, I'm special." And so I was just refuting your idea that maybe I was saying, or that the Gospels somehow indicated that Jesus was that way or something. I mean, I don't know. I just know that you were saying that Jesus was, not like Jesus wasn't supposed to be all, "Hey, I'm special" and whatnot. And I was just pointing out that in the Gospels, Jesus wasn't, characteristically in the Synoptics, having all this bravado about who he was and what he could do. So that's not something that I would ever suggest, and it's also not found in the Gospels.
Yeah, sometimes your arguments come across a little bit ambiguous. So I'm just saying, maybe sometimes if I don't address it correctly, maybe that could be on your end too. I'm just saying. But I would like to address that actually. Did you know several times in the book of John that where Jesus was, especially the one, I think it's John 19 or 18, somewhere in there, where he's riding on an ass in Jerusalem, and they run to him and they said, and they want to worship him. They go, "Jesus, I want to worship you," and all this and that. And then he goes away and he rides away. So I don't see that. I don't see that what you're talking about. That persona
so
that you're
saying that in John, Jesus does not proudly proclaim that he is the Son of God.
No, he even rides away and even says he went to pray. Like when these people are trying to worship him and such, that he would walk away and go out of their presence. I think that alone puts doubt on what you're trying. I mean, that kind of leads. I don't think that comports with what you're trying to say.
Okay, well, I mean, literally all over the Gospel of John, it has Jesus proclaiming to be the Son of God. It's actually one of the characteristic things that differentiates John from the Synoptic Gospels.
Can you
because
elaborate on that? Like, unpack that. What do you mean by when you say Son of God? Like a divine, eternal Son of God, or what are you trying to say when you say that?
Well, I mean, I just mean Son of God. What he means in everything as being the Son of God. He's the Son of God. Why do we have to define this?
Well, because you're trying, like I'm saying, I don't know if you're doing this on purpose. I'm not going to go there and say you're doing it on purpose, but you're doing a caricature of Jesus, like he's some supernatural magnet or something, or he has these miraculous abilities,
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Praise, but that is not anything that I've ever said.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to. If you would elaborate more of what's your staple point that you're trying to bring across here of your argument? If you can do that.
That it wasn't until the Gospel of John was Jesus proud and very boastful about being the Son of God. Prior to that, he was very quiet about it. He even went as far as to tell people.
I just addressed that. He says I'm not doing that. So I guess I gave you several circumstances in John where he walked away from people, like where they were trying to worship him. He would right away or go pray. So I think that point is moot. I gave you several examples with that.
We can move on. Well, we can move on to the next thing. So you talked about the reliability of miracles. Could you explain that a little bit? Like, because I have written down here as my note being that John was written in the lifetime of Jesus, which there's no evidence to suggest that actually. He was right, or the gospel was written in the 2nd century, most likely. So, I mean, could you expand a little bit on like why the miracles are reliable, especially considering the fact that, the miracles that Jesus did are copied from the Old Testament?
Sure. Yeah. And this is in my opening presentation that I gave an example of a hostile source or documentation of Jesus doing magic from the Talmud. And that is, to me, this is what all the other scholars come to the same conclusion as me. That is valid evidence of a real miracle worker. That's one apparent example. But there's also Romans talking about magic too, with performing magic.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, you're the one bringing up magic here. I'm not saying that miracles are magic.
Just saying that's what the Talmud says. I'm just quoting what it actually says.
Okay, well, I of course, I don't remember verbatim what your quote said, but I don't remember it talking about Jesus being the one that was doing the healing. I remember something about, was it like a priest or something that got bit by a snake, and then he went running for somebody to heal him, and he died before the healing could happen?
Yes, his name is Jacob.
Okay. So I mean, I don't understand how you translate that particular quote to being about Jesus when it's not even about Jesus.
Well, no, that was a side. That was just a side example to help demonstrate that the Talmud did document these type of things into their records. So I could read this again for you. I'll just. Real quick. So, quote, not only do hostile accounts fail to deny Jesus' supernatural abilities, they also seem to support the ability of his followers to heal in his name. In the Talmud, there is a story about a rabbi who was bitten by a venomous snake and calls on a Christian named Jacob to heal him. Unfortunately, before Jacob can get there, the rabbi dies. And this is from Morton Smith, a scholar. So that's what I was trying to bring across to you with that argument.
Okay, well, I still don't see that as being evidence of the reliability of miracles, primarily because I don't see it. I mean, it's just simply not evidence that a miracle was done. I mean, what evidence do you have that any of the miracles of Jesus were actually done.
Well, it depends what your standard criteria is. What is your criteria? Does it have to be so I gave you a non-biblical source. I guess that's not good enough, but I can give you a biblical source in John that does the same thing. Is that going to be good
so
enough?
Let me clear something up real quick. It's not that it was, not good enough or anything like that. It's just simply that it wasn't evidence. Like that literally was not evidence of the reliability of miracles. That was just an anecdotal story of some guy who got bit by a snake and didn't get to a healer fast enough.
No. I'm talking about the Talmud and Jesus. They say
that particular story right there doesn't actually prove whether or not miracles happen. So what I'm asking for is evidence, any kind of evidence, like, and not from the Gospels, because the Gospels are the claims that Jesus did these things. So they would have to be outside sources from the Gospels or something like that. Just even a mild reference to it that Jesus did these specific miracles.
Well, I mean, see that's standard. Like I say, you're importing in your modern lenses and your standards and criteria and imposing it into an ancient text. And all the ancient texts back then, they didn't have other external witnesses and other accounts to confirm that these things happen. And I laid all this out in my opening, and this is what we call a presentism fallacy. That is a fallacious error to do that. Nope. And I pointed that out.
I know that you pointed that out, but also that's not my criterion for evidence. And so, I mean, I'm just simply not falling into that fallacy. For instance, like I know you in one of your quotes, you referenced Alexander the Great. The best historian that wrote the best biography about Alexander the Great was Arrian, and he was writing 500 years after Alexander the Great lived. And that's a perfectly good source, but it's because he was using firsthand accounts from two of Alexander the Great's generals. He names the sources in his biography. He tells us where he got them from. He also names off other people that had firsthand accounts of Alexander the Great. So it doesn't really matter so much the time frame from when something was written. It depends on what their primary sources are and whether or not they're independent of the Gospels.
Okay,
that's
so
literally
I like to
my only criteria,
to that.
which is not anything that would be in that presentism fallacy that you mentioned. So if you could just give me evidence that is independent of the Gospels that would corroborate Jesus doing miracles, then
I'm going to respond to that. So I think that's shifting the goalposts, and it does fall in the presentism fallacy because you're importing in your modern ideas and assumptions and criterion into an ancient time period, which that is I'm unfair. That's unfair to them. Oh, hold on. Let me finish. I'm gonna. You know who Tim O'Neill is? He's an atheist historian. He responds to this.
He's not a historian.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's what he is. He's actually labeled that if you look him up on several sites. So I'm just saying. He's chronicled that. So
he's not. He doesn't hold. Does he hold a history degree?
Yeah, he does.
I think that he does.
So, okay, here's what he says, and he says, quote, "For example, few people in the ancient world were as prominent, influential, significant, famous as Carthaginian General Hannibal. He came close to crushing the Roman Republic, was one of the greatest generals of all time, and was famed throughout the ancient world for centuries after his death down to today. Yet, how many contemporary mentions of Hannibal do we have? Zero. We have none. So if someone as famous and significant as Hannibal has no surviving contemporary references to him in our sources, does it really make sense to base an argument about the existence or non-existence of a Galilean peasant preacher and the lack of contemporary references to him? Clearly, it does not. So I'd like for you to respond to Hannibal. That'd be great.
Okay, so first off, with Tim O'Neill, just to be specific, I did look up his credentials on his site historyforatheists.com. He's got a bachelor's degree with honors in English and history, and a research master's degree from the University of Tasmania with a specialization in historicist analysis of medieval literature. So, I mean, this will be an example of a appeal to false authority, because he doesn't actually have the credentials for talking about the first century, whereas authors that I use actually do have those particular credentials.
But I'm not really even appealing to his credentials. I'm appealing to what he said. Could you address what he actually said, the meat and potatoes of what he said?
Well, now you were talking about Hadrian?
I'm talking about Hannibal.
Or sorry, not Hadrian, Hannibal. Okay, I'm sorry, I was busy looking up that thing. Could you repeat what he said about Hannibal?
Right. So we have zero contemporary or external references to him or accounts. I'll put it this way: non-Hannibal accounts of Hannibal. Zero. And we also have no contemporary accounts of Hannibal either.
Okay, hold on. I'm pulling out. Like I didn't come prepared to talk about other historical figures out there. I came prepared to talk about Jesus.
But you see how that's relevant though, because you're not being fair to your how you're applying it to both sides. So if you're going to say Hannibal is justified.
Okay, can I read from my actual section on Hannibal that's in that I prepared for my app?
Sure. Yeah.
So the flow of precious metals and excavated camps materials corroborate Hannibal's existence. He has coins and a bust that are most likely him. Epitaphs of soldiers from both sides of the war attest to his existence. Polybus wrote extensively about Hannibal. He had eyewitness accounts of Hannibal, first-hand accounts of people that knew Hannibal, and bronze inscriptions. Livy is also a good source for Hannibal's existence, even though he wrote 100 years after Polybus. Livy had access to state documents that reference Hannibal. Like Livy, Cornelius Nepos, Diodorus, Corlius Antipater, Silenius Calatinius, I'm not good at pronouncing these names, Valerius Antius, and Claudius Quadra something, all wrote about Hannibal within 100 years of their lives. Cato the Elder, Roman historian Fabius Pictor, Solius of Lacedaemon, and Silenus of Chalcete wrote about Hannibal. Lucius Sinus Almietus wrote a first-hand account of Hannibal while he was a Roman war prisoner. We have a lot of evidence for Hannibal, and it doesn't have to be like a first-hand account, even though we have evidence where secondary accounts that include first-hand accounts of Hannibal. So that is my quality of evidence right there. It's either first-hand accounts of something happening, or it could be second-hand accounts that include references to first-hand accounts. Also physical things, although I'm not expecting physical things to be in existence for Jesus. Since we're talking about evidence and whether or not like my criteria fits this presentism thing, my criteria for the evidence for what we're talking about matches everything else for historical studies. I'm just going by general historical study methods of how we know something happened in history.
Okay, so you had a couple physical things. What we do have, we have coins of Caesar, and we even have a pilot stone. So I mean, they're not directly pointing. They're not saying, "Oh, look, this is Jesus," but they confirm that there was people or characters or figures of that time that showed that they physically existed. So why couldn't I use that in place of Jesus then?
Well, we have fictional narratives now that include real people. I believe, what was it? Neil deGrasse Tyson, I believe he appeared either in Superman or I think it was in Superman. He appeared in Superman. Does that make Superman real?
Well, I can say the same thing about Hannibal. Does that, because there's a coin? Does that make the evidence valid? Then could it just be made up and be some type of supernatural myth or something back then? So anyone can play that game.
That are actual
Anyone
money
can dismiss anything.
That has Superman on it, though.
No, you said there were some coins and then some first-hand accounts 100 years, which, I mean, we do have that anyway of
No,
Jesus
we do not
Christ.
have any first-hand accounts of Jesus, and we definitely don't have coins of Jesus, but I'm not expecting coins. But no, I mean, the emperors and leaders had coins minted in their names all the time. That's why we would find coins with Hannibal's likeness on them. That's just one facet. Like, that's one piece of evidence that supports his existence. There's many other things, including first-hand accounts as recorded by later historians.
Okay, so we have James' tomb. Are you familiar with that? That actually says James, the brother of Jesus. Oh, was that not good enough, though?
Ossuary. You're talking about the ossuary, right?
Right, James, brother of Jesus. It's been authenticated.
The thing that was actually proven to be a forgery? Yeah,
No,
I know
it
about
hasn't.
that.
There's nowhere has ever been. If you could actually give citation of that, I would love to see that. We actually have archaeologists
I'll have to pull it up later
and
because,
historians.
like I said, I mean, I came to
I mean,
debate
it's just
whether or
convenient
not
for you
Jesus
just to deny
not
anything you
really
want. It's
James
denialism.
existed. But it's fairly easy to find on the internet how the James ossuary is not authentic, and it's actually been
Well,
proven.
I can
to
give
be
you a source
later
right now that shows it is because I've researched it myself. So I would say no.
I mean, I
that
research
is
it too.
faulty.
I just don't find the first thing that confirms my bias.
Oh, so yeah, isn't that convenient for you to dismiss something because it doesn't comport to you? But when I bring up something, all of a sudden, it doesn't comport to your criteria of evidence. See,
I have reasons
this
to.
is exactly what I had in my opening and my presentation, that because of your philosophical bias, you will never accept evidence. And I gave citations from people.
No, I don't have a philosophical
authorities.
bias against Jesus. And this is, in fact, one of the things he brought up, which was a quote by Bart Ehrman right at the very end that says that myths have an agenda. I have no agenda. I really don't care whether or not Jesus existed in history. Like, Jesus could have existed in history. In fact, there were multiple Jesuses that existed in history. And I know for a fact that there were people named Jesus that the later gospel authors used to model their Jesus off of. So, I mean, I just don't think that Jesus, as depicted in the Bible, which is specifically what this debate is about, does not exist, because there's simply no evidence to suggest the things that are recorded in the Gospels and in Acts are real. Like, there's just simply no evidence. You don't have anything outside of the gospel.
I've given you evidences over evidences. You just don't accept them because of your biases. And I've given you the Talmud. For some reason, you didn't accept the Talmud. I've given you James, the ossuary. That's for some reason that wasn't good enough for you.
And there's evidence that refutes James' ossuary.
But you haven't demonstrated, though. You're just making a claim. You haven't really shown that.
You haven't just made claims? I mean, this entire, like, your entire opening statement was just quotes from other historians that do not lay out actual evidence. All they were claims. Like, at one point, you had a quote that said that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses between the 40s and the 60s. That did not include any kind of evidence that would solidify that the Gospels existed at those times.
I gave you that because, like, the destruction of the temple, and, like, you kind of just, like, hand waved and, like, tried to, divert and tried to deflect, and you really didn't address that. And I've given evidences tonight. It's just that you do not want to accept them, and I'm showing that.
It's not that I don't want to accept them. It's that there's evidence that refutes them. And the evidence that refutes them is more convincing than the evidence that affirms whatever claim.
Well, then please,
it's not a bias,
if that is
it's
true,
an
then
ignorance
outline
thing.
these refutations in.
Huh?
You just made a claim. I'm saying if that's true, then please outline your refutations. Then, I just think you're just making blatant claims out of nowhere, right? You haven't really demonstrated
I've given you
that.
plenty of evidence. Like I've given you evidence. I've explained my thinking on a lot of different things. So I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about. If you're talking about James's ossuary, I mean, like I said, I came prepared to talk about whether or not the biblical Jesus existed, not whether or not James or if the ossuary was a thing. But I do know that there is evidence that shows that the name on the the extra part on the ossuary that talks about it being of James, they added on to it that it was the brother of Christ or whatever. I know for a fact
I can
that there's
refute that.
evidence out there that refutes that.
Yes,
And you can go look
yes,
it
I
up.
can.
Anybody
I have it
go
right
look
here.
it up.
In fact, I could share this with. I can put this in the chat. If you allow me, I could read the refutation of what you just said, but I just need time. I don't think we have enough time. But if there is, I would love to actually address that and with your claims. Is that possible? I can do that, SFT. But I don't know if John would even allow that to happen. So I don't know.
What control do I have over this?
Well, no, because I would have to have at least 5 minutes of open speak time, and that's all I need to refute your claim.
Okay, well, maybe you can just give it to me afterwards because we've only got 10 minutes, and
Okay.
I mean, we've really only covered.
That's my point. That's what I was saying. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the chat, and then you can look at it later. "10 minutes clock." All right. So there's the citation right there. You can look it up yourself. That refutes everything you just said. So anyway, I mean, I've given evidence tonight. Another thing is too, you misrepresented my evidence of the Talmud too. It wasn't just a guy named Jacob. It was also Jesus, his own mention of himself in the Talmud. Did you know the Jews wrote about him in the Talmud?
About Jesus?
Yeah.
No, they did not write about Jesus that supposedly started Christianity.
Yeshua, that's Jesus. That's actually in the Talmud. He performed miracles and he performed magic. And this is what they got mad about. And this is my citation I showed. See, I've given evidence of my claims.
So since we're talking about the Talmud, the Jesus that appears in the Talmud actually existed under King Genneus. That was around 80 BCE. So that's about 100 years prior to the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity. So that's why it doesn't actually reference the Jesus that started Christianity, is that he was just too early or too far back in history in order for him to be that particular Jesus.
The dating has nothing to do with the credibility of the passage itself. Just because it was written after doesn't mean like, oh look, they didn't write it just after it happened. So I think that's a flimsy argument at best.
It's not a flimsy argument. It's a scholarly argument. This is the consensus of people in the field of Talmud scholarship that the Yeshua or Jesus that is mentioned in the Talmud is under King Genneus.
So according to you then, that there was another Jesus crucified then. You do know that they mentioned that, right?
Yes, I do. There were plenty of people crucified. Do you think that Jesus was the only person crucified?
Performing magic? No.
Okay, so why would you bring that up? Like, what does it matter that he was crucified?
Because it's not just some ordinary yokel named Jesus they're talking about. They're talking about a miraculous Jesus, and that's my point. And I gave citation that from scholars and historians to demonstrate that. So it's not just anecdotal. I actually have validation from scholars, and it's not an appeal to authority at all. It's just you can confirm your case, your argumentation through authorities, and I don't think you understand that.
No. I understand it perfectly. But the Talmud Jesus that you're talking about is under King Genneus. So unless you're suggesting that Christianity actually started 100 years before it supposedly started, I mean, I don't see how it helps your case. I mean, this is pretty clear cut.
So I'm gonna give some examples that make your claim foolish. It's really pathetic, really. And I'm going to give some examples here. Let's see. Okay, what about, let's see here. I'm just going to get real quick at some names, and then we'll probably go to whatever the question and answer period. All right. So what about Aristotle? His accounts of him are around 1450 years after Aristotle was written. So does that mean Aristotle didn't exist? All the accounts written about Aristotle didn't happen? What about Herodias? 1,300 years later. Pliny the Younger was 750 years. Does that mean Pliny the Younger didn't exist, or that account's not true? Does that mean whatever the accounts of Pliny the Younger were written about him? So does that mean it's not true? So your argument is, like I said, flimsy, and it's actually been destroyed.
No, it hasn't, because you're totally strawmanning my entire criteria for historicity. So, I mean, honestly, I don't see how we can continue in a debate when you're willfully misrepresenting my position.
Or pushing your unfair criteria and putting your modern viewpoints into an ancient text or ancient text in history. So that is what we call a presentism fallacy.
So, I mean, like I said, there's no point in us having this debate any further right now, since you cannot simply get my criteria for evidence. You cannot actually repeat what I said earlier about criteria for evidence. So, I mean, you just simply don't understand it.
You talked about, I addressed this with the example I talked about with that Roman guy. I forgot the guy we were talking about, actually. Hold on, I'll get his name real quick. And I addressed all your points. It's just you just don't accept it.
No, you didn't. I mean, you may have addressed all of my points, but I mean, honestly, I couldn't tell that you addressed all my points, because most of the time when I asked a question, you answered a completely separate different question.
So I addressed Hannibal, but you said there were some people that had some type of coins, and like 100 years later. But what you're doing is just special pleading that these are evidence.
What exactly? What am I special pleading?
So you mentioned that there was first-hand accounts for 100 years later, or 100 years afterwards. Somehow, that's not what I said. That is not congruent with the biblical accounts or the non-historical accounts of Jesus. Where somehow those are not in the same type of category. So why is it that you put Jesus outside that category, but Hannibal inside that category?
When I was talking about Hannibal, I did not say there were first-hand accounts 100 years afterwards. That is simply not what I said. So I don't know. Maybe we can return to this, because I know that we got to get to question and answer and everything. Yeah. And I mean, it's already getting pretty late for me, and I know for you guys too. But I mean, maybe you can. Maybe you could just go over this entire conversation again. Actually, listen to what I said about my criteria, and see if you can understand what I said, because I did not say that there were first-hand accounts 100 years later.
I think it's pretty clear that you have an unfair bias, though, and an unfair balance is how you balance out the evidence. You'll accept Hannibal, but you won't accept Jesus. I think.
Okay, let me jump in real quick. What I want to do before the Q&A, and thanks so much, guys, for keeping it respectful and engaging. The chat loved the debate. It flew by, so good job to the both of you. If you want to take a minute just to kind of sum everything up, if you wanted to address anything that you feel you didn't address during the discussion, you can kind of consider it a quick closing statement, and then we can jump into the Q&A if that works for you guys.
Yeah. John can go first if he wants, or I can go first. It's up to him. I'll let him pick.
No, you can go first.
All right. So I think tonight I showed the scholarly viewpoint of Jesus being the biblical Jesus. He did exist. He historically existed, and he is demonstratably miracles are tied in with that. So that's how we know that the biblical Jesus existed historically. So I think I demonstrated that tonight through not just citations from the authorities, which that's their life's work. That's what they do. So we can't appeal to that. But also, I did give other side arguments as well to corroborate that. And all I seen from Godless Engineer, I actually like Godless Engineer. I think he's very passionate. I respect that, and I respect his arguments. But I think he shifted the goalpost several times, and he imposed or brought into his modern viewpoints and biases and criterias and standards that what he considers should be back thousands of years ago. What was it, 2000 or whatever? And I think that is, like I said, like I've shown, that constitutes what we call a presentism fallacy. It's fallacious reasoning to do that. So I put the evidence out there, and people can go back to the beginning of the debate and check that out themselves and see. I just think that Godless Engineer has a confirmation bias. He probably would say the same thing about me. So I'll let the people decide for themselves where the evidence leads. And I think I gave a good case for the biblical Jesus being historical. And with that, I end my time and yield to John.
Okay.
Go ahead, John.
So tonight I laid out a clear line of logic that connects the Old Testament ideas about what Jesus was supposed to be and do, and directly connected it to what ended up in the Gospels, which is what we're talking about here tonight. Whether or not the biblical Jesus was a historical Jesus. And I don't think that the biblical Jesus was a historical Jesus due to the lack of evidence that supports that idea. The fact that Mark got all of his theology from Paul, and he invented miracle stories as well as other parts of theology using the Old Testament scriptures, which is exactly what Paul said or is exactly what how Paul got his information about Jesus and his theology. So all of the theology of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and everything like that stems from visions and the scriptures. And since those things are solid facts that critical historical people, historians, accept and have evidence to support, that means that the biblical Jesus definitely did not exist. Of course, I go a little bit farther, and I don't think that a historical Jesus existed at all. I think that there's probably about a 33% chance that he did. But still, I think that the most probable situation is that he didn't exist, and that all of the information that we know about Jesus actually stems from the understanding of the first Jewish Christians, their understanding of the scriptures. And so, given all of that substantial information that is not ad hoc or baseless in any kind of way, I conclude that Jesus probably didn't exist, because there is a very rational and reasonable position that suggests that Jesus was made up using Jewish ideas and Jewish scripture.
Awesome. Okay, thanks so much for those concluding statements, guys. Really good debate. Flew by. We've got some good questions. But as Godless Engineer said, it is getting late, so we're going to fly right through these. I will read through as many as I can and just word for word. So first question I have here is from Redefine Living. Thanks for your question. Question for Godless. Do you know that you are not a special case beyond forgiveness and Jesus loves you very much? Take your time.
I guess thank you, but I really don't care if Jesus loves me.
Okay. And actually, he's got another question for Praise. So you both get a question from Redefine Living. He asks you, Praise, is it true that Jesus sacrificed for us while we were yet sinners, and therefore his offer can be accepted before we get right with God?
Correct. I affirm that as well. Yeah, that's the beautiful message of the gospel. And yes.
Okay. Super chat from Earl of Sandwich. Thank you so much. He says the carpenter is referenced to Taliesin. Carpenter or woodman refers to the druidic wisdom Jesus gained on his journey. This is a druid tale. To be honest with you, I have no idea what he's talking about. So if you guys want to comment on that.
I definitely don't think that Jesus was a druid tale or anything. Jesus is definitely born out of Jewish understanding and Jewish history.
Did you have a response there, Praise, at all, or did you want me to move on?
Yeah, I affirm that as well. And if you read Psalms 2:9-ish, that even back then, thousands of years ago, that's actually over 1,000 years before it was fulfilled in the New Testament, that it was written, the Son of God would be born through a woman. Actually, Psalms and Isaiah. So, yeah.
Okay. Last response there, Godless?
I don't have a response.
All right, perfect. So we're moving on to super chat from Stupid Horror Energy. Thanks so much for the super chat. For Godless Engineer, I know you respect consensus, but why not in this particular instance? Go ahead.
Well, I feel like I have a pretty good case against the consensus. The consensus is built upon Christian understanding of things, and primarily those that establish the consensus in this context are New Testament scholars. Most New Testament scholars have a faith-based position to believe in a historical Jesus. So obviously they're going to present arguments and evidence that would support that particular position. But when people from the outside look at this particular situation, that what they end up finding is that the evidence does not support the final conclusion. So when these scholars say that this is the consensus and there's no need to ever question it, that should make you raise an eyebrow and look at what their evidence is. Anytime anybody's telling you this is the fact, do not look at the evidence for it. You should definitely investigate the evidence.
Awesome. Thanks for the response there. Quick response, Praise?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a distortion. First of all, we have atheist historians and secular historians saying that these things like Jesus was before miracles. I gave citation for that. But also it's not only did he he performed miracles, but he existed. Period. The character himself. That's indisputable, and I think he's coming with this at his own lens, with his secular lens. So I'm going to go ahead and go ahead, SFT.
Yeah,
go ahead.
The question was for you, Godless, if you want to have the last word there.
I mean, no, I don't need to say anything else.
No problem. Thanks for the responses, guys. Next question is from Gavin. Question for both. The major scholarly consensus from secular and theist New Testament historians is that Jesus existed. Agree or disagree? We can start with you, Godless.
Well, the question was the majority of secular.
Yes, the major scholarly consensus from secular and theist New Testament historians.
Well, so I would contend that there's very, very few New Testament scholars that are secular, and then you have people outside of the realm of New Testament scholarship and history in general that also have their opinions on it. I would say that the current consensus is that Jesus existed, but still that's built on faulty evidence.
Okay, thank you. Praise, your turn.
Yeah, I would say I could give a list of over 300 liberal scholars that are secular, and I have their names personally. I can share with people. So I don't know if that's exactly true or not.
Please do.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that might not be true. I'll look into that. I think it's a good mixture. I think that there's liberal people or secular, but also theistic Christians as well that are scholars.
Well, if I can, because Gary Habermas will not actually release his list of supposed thousands of scholars or whatnot. If you could give me the list of 300 scholars that agree with this, I would be appreciative.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, thank you so much for your responses there. Let me make sure I at least get through the super chat. So, okay, another one here from Stupid Horror Energy. Um, Thank you so much. Question is, okay, this one looks like it's for both again. So she says, Bart Ehrman says that the gospel writers saw themselves as writing in a genre that did not require a self-identification of an author. Agree or disagree? So whoever wants to start.
Okay. I mean, I would agree because of how they were writing these things. They were writing them for their communities, for their individual sects. These were the gospels of their particular sect. So it wasn't that these different gospels were in massive circulation with all of the Christians. These were just known initially as the gospel. And so it only later became known as the separate gospels of, the gospel of Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John. So I would agree that the context in which they were written in does not necessarily dictate that they would put an author on it, or even a title.
And praise?
So yes, I would actually agree with that because that was the style and format, the way they did things back then in their literature. You have what they would do is give internal evidence of who the writer was, and Lucian's. I gave an example of that. How there's other people, historians, and they accept that Lucian is an eyewitness or an account that's valid. So yeah.
Okay, thanks for both your responses. Let me just make sure I didn't miss a super chat. Okay, this one, it looks like he's coming at you, Godless Engineer, so you can respond however you want. It's from Michael Dresden. He likes to stir up trouble. So he says, Godless Engineer lost to Hovind. LOL, never forget. Go ahead, Godless.
I mean, I didn't, but I'd rather not address anything of that nature.
Awesome. Okay, that's it for the super chats. And let's do one more question here. I don't think I asked this one. We've got a lot, but this could be a good one because it's for both. So question is, isn't the falsifiability of the resurrection evidence that Jesus existed? If the resurrection was a hoax, it would have been easy to debunk. Agree or disagree? Go ahead.
So I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
Yeah, just one sec. Let me see. Isn't the falsifiability of the resurrection evidence that Jesus existed? If the resurrection was a hoax, it would have been easy to debunk. Agree or disagree?
I'm wondering how it would be easy to. I guess ultimately I disagree because I don't know how it would be easy to debunk. I don't understand how that could be easy to debunk. Like a similarly not easy to debunk thing is the Pauline Creed, where he talks about 500 witnesses or 500 people that witness the resurrected Jesus. A lot of apologists like to say that it would be easy to falsify that by just asking people, well, did this really happen? But I would have to ask, how would you know who to ask? Paul doesn't give an indication of where these people were, who they were, where you could find them, where they might be now or at any point. He doesn't give any kind of identifying information, just that 500 people saw him. So, I mean, how could you really falsify that? It seems like it's actually rather unfalsifiable, just like the crucifixion is in the New Testament.
And how would you respond there, Praise?
Yeah, I would say the resurrection, the biggest case for it is the body itself. Still to this day, there has never been a body found, and through any historical records, and that should be also a red flag. How can someone like the Romans never mention, oh, look, we found the body? I mean, that should be so simple. Just to debunk and say, hey, this is a myth. We found the body. This Christian stuff is ridiculous. Nowhere in any any Roman record we've ever seen that. So the body itself is the biggest standard of evidence that the resurrection happened. Boom, right there.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Those are some good questions, good super chats from the audience. Very lively audience tonight. So you guys brought the numbers. It was a good debate. I'm going to hand it over to you guys just from some closing words, closing thoughts. And if you want to plug in your channels, go ahead. But time has flown by. It's getting late. So I want to thank you both for giving us your time. Go ahead. If you want to start there, Godless, go ahead.
Well, I do appreciate it. I'm sorry if I got a little, if I interrupted a little too much and I got a little bit too heated. But I enjoyed the conversation in general. And I hope that we can do it at some point in the future, do it again at some point in the future. And I hope that everybody will check me out on Godless Engineer. I love all of the comments, even the ones that are kind of crappy towards me. They make for good content. So if you want to go there and check those out, leave those kinds of comments, that would be great. If you want to, check out my app on the app stores called Crestus. It's available on Google and Apple, the Google Play Store. And so, that's all I got. I've got some great things coming out for the app, including using a new foundation, a new framework for it. And I'm working on expanding all the information in it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate those final words there, Godless. I'll throw it over to you, Praise.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion with John. He's very intelligent and has a lot of arguments. I respect that. And to me, of course, we're going to get heated because we both are, we both take our position seriously, and I expect that. So I thought it was a really good conversation. I would love to do it again. Maybe in the future we could do that again or something. So it's up to him, whatever we can get going. So yeah, I hope so. I think everyone that came out tonight in the chat watching, hopefully they learned something. They can decide for themselves what, what viewpoint, whatever. So the evidence. So I'll just put it in the people watching this, to put it in their hands. Whatever they want to do, they'll do. So I'm going to end it there.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, no, it was a good, respectful, and I think much needed dialogue. So a round two at some point in the future would be fine with me. So good job to the both of you. Thanks for keeping it fun. And we're going to